This is Curious Incident, a podcast for special needs families and your window into the world of special education. Special needs parenting can be challenging, and we want to make it easier by providing you with the resources you need to help your child. Let's delve deep into the world of learning differently with your host, Special Education Attorney Dayan.
I am pleased to present my colleague Dana Jonson as my next guest on the Curious Incident podcast. We will be discussing the ramifications we are seeing in the aftermath of COVID-19. Dana is a dedicated civil rights attorney based in Connecticut. As a special education attorney, her private practice is devoted to championing the civil and legal rights of children with disabilities. Before her legal career, Dana served as a special education teacher and administrator in Boston, holding a K-12 certification in intensive special needs. Her personal experience as a mother to 5 children with various special education needs and as a foster parent to many more adds a profound layer of empathy and understanding to her professional pursuits. Dana is also a podcast star in her own right. In fact, she inspired me to start this one. Dana, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm usually on the other side.
Absolutely. So I know we practice in different states and our state and local laws may differ, but talk a little bit about IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, in a general way so parents can understand how expansive and protective this federal law is supposed to be.
Sure, and I think it's important to start with the fact that the IDEA is the floor, not the ceiling. So the IDEA is a federal law that governs special education, and then states can provide additional protections for parents if they so choose. The primary, or at its core, the IDEA provides a free, appropriate public education. What that means has been hashed out in many courts, and it continues to be hashed out today. But the principles of the IDEA are the FAPE, the free, appropriate public education, an appropriate evaluation, if the child qualifies, an IEP, an individual education plan, and an IEP. And then if the parents disagree with what's happening with the program, they are entitled to their due process rights, which means they can hire us and go after the school to get what they need or what they think their child needs. As far as school, I don't know if you wanted me to talk about the state differences or...
We can get there in a second,
okay.
But you're
Sure.
Exactly right. That's why we have jobs, right?
Yes,
because
exactly.
There is due process, a
Yes.
formal system that parents can use to enforce their rights under this law.
Exactly.
So let's talk about the state and local differences.
Well, I think it's important for people to understand their state laws because some do differ and have different regulations. So, for example, I think New York has more specific regulations about evaluations and categories for identifying a student under special education law. I know that in Connecticut, we have a very comprehensive birth to 3 program, and we focus on transition. I think we allow transition planning earlier, or we mandate transition planning earlier at a slightly younger age. So there are differences like that work in favor of parents, but they can't. It's a civil rights law, so it really is in favor of the child and the family. So a state can't say, well, I'm giving more protections to the school district, because that's not who requires them. In Connecticut, we also have a law right now that states that when we go to a due process hearing, the school board goes first, which is a big deal because I think it's a big deal because schools have the resources. They are able to provide their own expert witnesses. They are able to get the time off from work. They get to make all their exhibits and copy them and organize them in a very easy fashion. And most of us, I know New York City is a different animal, so I won't speak to that, but most of us who do this are in solo or small offices, and parents have to hire us. They don't have an attorney on retainer like the school district does. And then we have to put all this stuff together. So it gives it's not an advantage to the parent. It is leveling the playing field slightly because there's no real advantage to parents in due process.
Right. It's recognizing this imbalance between the behemoth school district and the individual parent and tries to make that more balanced.
Yes, exactly.
Do you want to talk about the review system, 1 tier versus 2?
Sure. Another difference between New York and Connecticut is that you guys have a 2-tier system. And so that's another important part of the process that parents need to understand. Ours in Connecticut is a 1-tier system, which means that at the administrative level, when we go after a school district and we file for due process, once that hearing is completed, if either party doesn't like the result and wants to appeal it, we go straight to federal court. In a place with a state with 2-tier systems like New York, you go back to the state, right? Back to the agency to get another review, not from the same hearing officer, from somebody else, but it's just another administrative level review. I don't know if that works well for you guys or not. To me, it sounds like another place for parents to spend their money before they have to go to federal court. And as we already said, the school districts have the advantage in that regard. So
it can cut both ways. In theory, it can be an easier, less formal way of resolving your issue before having to go into federal court. But as you said, on the other side, it could be another barrier that you have to overcome before getting your matter fairly resolved.
Right.
What are the most important things parents should be aware of regarding special needs and special education in a post-pandemic world?
Schools are out of money. That's
wonderful.
Bottom line. I know, isn't that great to hear? It's kind of always the truth. But if we look at even just evaluations, just think of evaluations, forget services. All the children who were supposed to get evaluated during that time period, then all the children who would have been discovered during that time period and evaluated. And then on top of that, children went home and parents realized that a lot of those children were not as independent as they thought they were. So suddenly we had this huge wave of children who needed to be identified and evaluated. And schools weren't equipped for that. They just don't have the staff. And I did have schools that were actually seeking outside people to do evaluations to catch us up. That is not cheap. These are not cheap evaluations. And that's just the evaluations. Now let's talk about the kids who lost services. I had 2 children who were profoundly autistic and did not get services for 7 months, and windows closed. Their skills they'll never regain. And that happened to a lot of children. And it's not anybody's fault. Nobody planned the pandemic, but it's just a fact that's out there. And so there's a ton of compensatory education that we had to get from school districts, which also costs a lot of money. And we're now on the other side of that in that, the statute of limitations is 2 years to go back to go after a school district, but we're still seeing that ramification of children being home for so long and all students missing instruction and all students falling behind.
So how do you counsel your clients, or what do you say to school districts when it's clear that budget or money is an issue? Because these are rights that don't depend on how much money the school district has in their budget, correct?
Correct. And it's the only civil right we negotiate, right? We negotiate down cost sharing for programs. We negotiate who's going to do the evaluation. We negotiate a ton of things. And negotiating the evaluations is probably the most popular thing. What I'm seeing now, so parents are entitled to these rights whether schools have the money or not. What I'm seeing now in my practice, where I practice in Connecticut, is that parents are not getting these things without an advocate or an attorney. They're just simply not. And I think a lot of schools have the sort of unspoken rule that unless they're going to fight us and cost us more money, let's just not spend anything. And we actually just got an email that was sent out that circulated through our community, that one of the schools has just announced they will not be hiring subs for paras. They're just not going to do it. So I don't know what's going to come of that. I'm sure we're going to get a lot of calls, but school districts are trying to find creative ways to not spend money, but that's not going to help in this situation. The other problem we do have, and I think it's important to mention, is that Congress has never fully funded the IDEA, which is part of the problem. So for people out there who like to make a difference and want to see some change, we really need to get our state and federal legislatures to fund special education.
So, already a frustrating process dealing with the school district, even more frustrating when there are these types of budgetary constraints. Parents need to understand that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. I think that's that expression.
Yeah.
And so the more you voice what you need and hold the school district accountable, the more success you're going to have getting it.
Exactly. And when you say that, holding the school district accountable, one of the ways that you really have to do that is to document everything, because if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. And I'll have parents come to me and say, I've been asking for this thing for 10 years. It's not in a single document. It didn't happen. So it's really important for parents to stay on top of the school district and hold them accountable, because no one's standing in line to advocate for your child.
Absolutely. Okay, so we covered the money and budget aspect. You want to talk about some of the kinds of issues you've been seeing post-pandemic?
Sure. In my office, the two largest issues that we're seeing are reading and mental health. And I think everybody knows we're having a mental health crisis in our country right now for a variety of reasons. I think one of the things that we as adults need to also recognize is that aside from being home and not socializing and not getting proper instruction, people were dying. Like, a lot of people were dying. And I think we as adults have managed to compartmentalize that and sort of put it behind us. But that really impacted a lot of kids, and particularly kids who knew people or, had it happening in their communities. So that right there is going to have a lasting impression on children. Then add to that children who didn't get to socialize, children whose school was 10 times harder because they didn't have support, children who are in unhealthy homes, right? Where it might be an abusive home, and now they have no escape, no reprieve. So there's a lot that went on. Another thing I'm seeing, and this really isn't pandemic related, I don't think, but one thing I'm seeing is a lot of transgender students coming out, which I think is wonderful and a great thing, and in no way, shape, or form a disability. But children who are transgender or gender fluid, they are more susceptible to mental health issues, and they're more susceptible to depression, anxiety, and suicide. And I cannot imagine what it's like to live in a body that I don't feel is mine, and then not be able to use facilities that I'm more comfortable in, or to be with people I feel more comfortable with. There are just so many restrictions that they hit every single day. And then there's also bullying, which has gone through the roof as well. That's another point. Post-pandemic, I think the mean kids came out meaner and the fragile kids came out more fragile, and that's not working well either. So there are just so many dynamics that came out of the pandemic that I think we're going to be seeing for years. And I've also heard from, say, college professors that they are shocked at the behavior of freshmen in college, that they're just not mature. Like they've never had to tell kids to put their phones away so much. And a lot of that is children who were during the pandemic. I had 5 teenagers during the pandemic. So they missed first jobs, they missed getting their license, all those sort of rites of passage that help them grow and become independent. And a lot of that disappeared.
So complicated and nuanced. And I understand that pandemics are not unprecedented. We've had them before, but this one was unprecedented in our lifetime. And it's interesting what you say about adults compartmentalizing and children or young adults struggling for ways to process and figure out how to deal with the horror that we experienced during that time and process all of those emotions. It's not simple. Yeah,
it's not simple. And I think we went into the pandemic with not as great an understanding about mental health. I do think that's one benefit, is that we're sort of forced into more understanding. But those are ramifications that are going to last for a long time for kids.
Okay, so you've covered mental health. You also mentioned reading. What about reading?
Well, I think a lot of children got home and suddenly weren't independent. And their parents started to realize they didn't know how to read. So there are cues maybe in the classroom or things the staff were doing that was helping children along. And once those prompts were removed, children were not independent and able to do what their parents thought they could. So we have a huge problem with reading in our country. And I think we're just starting to understand that. And I do think that's something that came to light in the pandemic. If you haven't, I strongly recommend listening to the podcast Sold a Story. It's a wonderful podcast about our reading systems and what has happened over the years and how we ended up in this place with really strong systems in place that don't teach kids how to read.
I didn't mention this in the intro, but you've shared with me that you yourself have dyslexia and ADHD. So this is something really core to who you are, something that you experienced as a student and still experience, right?
Yes, exactly. And so our brains are not programmed to understand written language. That's just not what we were supposed to do. But we have to do it. And that's how else are you going to educate children en masse if they don't know how to read? So 1/3 of our population will just learn how to read. Being around the written word and language, they'll figure it out. There's another 1/3 that will require instruction, but not much. They're just going to need some instruction to get there. And then there's this last 1/3 that will only learn if they're taught in a very specific way. And that's the 1/3 I fell into. I grew up in schools that didn't know how to identify or remediate these things, so I remember it quite well. And this whole Sold a Story investigation was so interesting to me because it was exactly my population. It was exactly what I went through. And we weren't teaching phonics. And we were teaching kids to do things like look anywhere but at the text to learn to figure it out. Guess the words is basically what you were learning to do. To this day, I don't read instructions. I'll just start looking at pictures. That doesn't always serve me very well. But there are a lot of things that go along with that. And, you know, I was somebody who got to 19 I got through freshman year of college before anyone noticed I couldn't read. We have a lot of kids out there who are able to self-accommodate and get pretty far until their work gets smarter than they are.
Can we pause right there for a second? Because I think this is happening all over the place with young students, that they're struggling with something that's being overlooked. The education system is not catching it. They're not getting the proper interventions. From your vantage point, looking back, how did that happen that you made it to 19 years old and none of your educators or administrators in the system or people who were working with you caught on to the fact that you were struggling with reading?
It's a great question. I did go to a lot of different schools for a variety of reasons, but I mean, we didn't have the IDEA yet. I mean, when I started school, not to date myself, but there was no IDEA yet. So no one was really looking for it. I was in accelerated math and remedial reading. And that was just baffling because when I was growing up, we didn't have this concept of learning disabilities and neuroplasticity and all that other stuff. It was you're smart or you're stupid. And I wasn't either, and nobody could figure it out. So I was going to redo 3rd grade until the state testing came back, and I was in the 98th percentile. And the teacher was like, well, we can't hold her back if that's where she is. So I guess we'll push her forward. You know, those were the days.
Wow.
Yeah. So, you know, I found out how to self-accommodate, and I was lucky and able to do that to a degree. I mean, school was hard for me, and I was always that kid at the very end negotiating with my teacher on how to get my grade up and what I could do and all of that. But it wasn't until I went to college where you were expected to be so much more independent. And I realized I didn't have any study skills, and I realized, you know, I just wasn't doing well. And I went to a learning center because my parents sent me there when I came home. And I was there maybe 10 minutes when they were like, we have to talk to your parents. Like, do you know she can't read?